I've had multiple death threats from these groups saying that if I come back to the Philippines, I'm going to have a bullet in my head.
Welcome back to I Spy, a podcast about the intriguing world of private investigators.
When he realised that I had locked on to all of that money that he had put away for himself, that just sent him over the edge. He then decided that he has to take steps to get rid of me. There are a number of people being asked who could carry out this hit on me.
In this episode, we meet Ken Gamble from IWF Global, a private eye who has successfully tracked and arranged the arrest more than once of Australia's most notorious conman, Peter Foster.
Convicted conman Peter Foster has been arrested in far north Queensland, accused of being involved in a multi-million-dollar gambling ring.
Ken has cracked all sorts of cases, including Foster's, using one of his secret weapons, an Agent X. But you will hear more about the mysterious agent and how Ken became Foster's nemesis later in the episode. But first, I want to know, what is life like for a private eye?
I think it's like a prize fighter. It's like a boxer. You know, 99% of your time you're training, and you have that 1% of glory where you get a result or you get into the ring and you fight for a title. It's very similar in our job. A lot of our job involves hard work. It's very mundane sometimes and very time consuming, particularly surveillance work where you may sit and watch, a person or a place for hours, days, weeks, or even months. I find my job a lot more exciting because I get to travel, I get to meet a lot of very interesting people, I get to be on the front line of police raids when people are arrested, and I get to see some of the criminals arrested that I investigate, which is very satisfying.
Is it dangerous as well? Have you ever been hurt during an investigation?
Oh yeah, it can be a very dangerous job, depending on the type of work you do. If you're a desktop investigator and you do research, you're not going to potentially put yourself at risk out there. But if you're doing frontline investigation work, particularly against criminal elements, and you don't necessarily have the backing of a police force behind you or any of that type of security or protection, you can put yourself in a lot of danger. And the dangers are not always it's not always a risk of someone coming after you either. It can be other risks, other unknown sort of risks. And I was attacked once in Sydney at Centennial Park. I caught an insurance cheat doing his karate practice one morning. He was actually a karate expert as well. And he chased me out of Centennial Park. He busted me filming him and chased me out of the park, and it turned into a massive brawl in the middle of the street. He stole my keys out of my car, actually, but he assaulted me. He was charged with assault, but he attacked me pretty violently. Lucky I could handle myself pretty well, but nevertheless, there was a big risk at that. There's always a risk when people bust you. So, and I certainly have colleagues that have suffered injuries during the course of their work.
One of his most dangerous cases was tracking Foster after he had caught him the first time.
He decided that he has to take steps to get rid of me. And he contacted people in the Philippines, Australians that, Australian underworld figures that were in the Philippines hiding out, who were also wanted by police. And he then set about, organising this now without going into any, secrets about how I found out. There were a number of people being asked who could carry out this hit on me. Not just one, but there were people being asked as to who can, get rid of me and what the cost would be. So he was shopping around for a hitman, basically, and then he found a person who said he would be able to organise it, and there was recordings made of those discussions. I won't go into how they were made, but there were recordings of those conversations that were made with this person in the Philippines that was organising this hit on me for $80,000 initially. That was the offer. Foster agreed to pay $30,000 up front and $50,000 once the job's done. But he was so excited about it. He's so sort of excited about the prospect of getting rid of me. He added a $100,000 bonus if it was done before Christmas of 2015, I think it was. So that's quite a bonus, 100,000 additional if it gets done quickly. So, but I had informants and sources all over the place that were telling me what was going on, and we were monitoring him very closely through surveillance and other means, and we knew a lot about what he was up to. So I knew that the stakes at that point were very high because I'd taken a lot of money from him. Not taken the money, but I had frozen the money, and we eventually had that money transferred, taken, through the court process. And I knew at that point the stakes in this case had gone to a new level. So I had to put things in place to make sure that I remained safe from any risk.
Foster was never charged over the allegations.
The whole thing sort of went away, which was really frustrating when you know that someone has tried to get you killed, and they had the phone records showed that he made calls to the Philippines to this particular individual. So we just kind of moved on from that and ended up putting him in prison anyway for that fraud for about 12 months.
So what happened when you caught up with Foster again?
He decided to do a runner from the Gold Coast. This is during June of last year, in the middle of COVID. Everyone's at home, and Foster's off up to Port Douglas to source a boat. He went up there to buy a luxury cruiser to escape the country. He decided at that point he's got to get out. This is the second time I've chased him in a boat as well. So he went up to Port Douglas sometime in June, mid to late June, and sort of secreted himself in a hideout in Port Douglas and started to try to buy a big $1 million boat. I, through my sources and contacts, I heard that he had left the Gold Coast, heading north. So I had a very highly motivated client who had lost a couple of $1 million to him very recently. That had just occurred, and this client who's from overseas contacted me just coincidentally to say that he'd been a victim of a scam, and it just so happened that this scam was the one that Foster was currently working on as of early last year. And when I heard a voice recording of the person purporting to be another person, I nearly fell off my chair. I said, "That's Peter Foster." I said, "I know exactly who's behind this scam, and I know all about the person that is in this recording." And the client was kind of dumbfounded. He couldn't believe that I had all this information. I said, "You're very, very lucky because, I've got a lot of information on this particular fraudster, and I know who it is." And I said, "We should be able to file a criminal complaint and get him arrested." And that's what we did. We prepared a complaint. We reported it to police, and subsequently, whilst we tracked him down, the police process was going on. They trying to get the charges filed and so forth. But there was a delay of about a month. So I ended up going up to Port Douglas and locking onto him with my female operative, Agent X, which I know you're probably curious to ask me about that. But I went up to Port Douglas, and booked into a resort there and started growing a beard and got a hat and sunglasses and, the standard private investigator disguise. And I started looking around for him and making inquiries, and it took me about 3 days to lock onto him. And from that point, we started surveilling him, on a daily basis. We realised that he had a couple of little puppy dogs with him, and he'd take them for a walk every day. And he had a very fixed routine whilst he was spending 12 hours a day on the computer, scamming other victims, mainly from the UK. And then we waited until the arrest warrant was issued, and once it was issued, the rest is kind of history. We planned to film the arrest. I briefed the police a couple of days before on what his routine was, and I got permission to have a camera. They said the police were not concerned about me having a camera crew or media as long as we didn't get in their way. That was the agreement, that we wouldn't be in their way, and that's exactly what happened. It was a sort of a textbook operation. It was well rehearsed. When the police arrested him on the beach, we immediately sprung out of the bushes onto the beach with our own cameras, and turned out there was not only a film crew, there was also a drone in the air, there was me with my iPhone, and there was Agent X, who actually captured the takedown on her phone on the opposite direction of the beach. So you couldn't have scripted a better scenario, for the purposes of catching something on film. It was just perfect.
Ken has also done a lot of work in other countries, and he says some in particular can be very dangerous.
The Philippines is a place where you can get people murdered very, very cheaply. There's a lot of paid hits that go on in the Philippines. It can be a very dangerous place if you're in the sights of someone who wants you killed. And I know the layout of the land over there very well. I've been working in the Philippines since the late 90s. I've got extensive relationships with law enforcement there. So I had a lot of police contacts, and I used to get around with SWAT teams following me around on some of my jobs.
When an 18-year-old backpacker disappeared late one night in a popular holiday spot, it had everyone asking questions, including Ken.
I realised that this case, the police had already made up their mind that he'd had an accident. They weren't really going to investigate anything further. And the more I looked at the case, the more I thought, hang on a minute, there's something not right about this accident. Someone just doesn't fall off the rocks and vanish, but their phone stays on for 13 more hours. If someone fell off the rocks in Byron Bay, particularly in Cozy Corner, where he was last sort of recorded, the phone would have gone in the water with him because he had it in his hand the whole time. We know that because he was doing searches and so forth. So there's all this digital data that I became very interested in. With a lot of missing person cases these days, the digital data tells a compelling story because there's a lot of information that can be constructed by digital data that the police don't usually do in a missing person case. For example, geolocation data and signal data, that is telecommunications signal data, that can be studied by a geospatial analyst, and very detailed charts and maps, even three-dimensional maps, can be put together to tell a story about where that phone was and what direction the phone was moving in during the last pings. So this is what we're doing in this case, is we're sort of reconstructing the 24-hour period immediately before and immediately after Theo vanished, and putting together some quite compelling evidence of what may have happened, I decided to do it pro bono because I didn't want to be, seen to be trying to capitalise on such an unfortunate event. So I decided that I would provide my work on a pro bono basis to try and help, and that's what I did. And just recently, we received. Well, actually, the information was received last year from an informant that claimed they overheard conversations of a person making admissions about being involved in Theo's disappearance, and that happened in a hotel south of Byron. And this information was reported to the police. They didn't really follow it up. They didn't believe it was credible. I tried to interview that person. We found out who the person was. I tried several times to interview him. He ran away from me, refused to speak to me. This is a young male in his 30s who has a police record. And eventually I decided a couple of months back to go back and try to. It was actually the anniversary. That's what prompted me to do it. It was the anniversary, the 2-year anniversary of Theo's disappearance, 31st of May. I decided to go back to Byron and really get to the bottom of this allegation that's really been haunting the family, because it's a very detailed explanation of what happened to Theo on that night, the type of people that he had met with and what he had engaged in, and that his death was potentially accidental, but he had been buried, and that certain people were involved. It was, a very kind of compelling story, but one which needed to be thoroughly investigated. So on the 31st of May, I went back to Byron. I attended the anniversary event on the beach. The local police commander was there. I had a conversation with him on that day, and the family were there, and it was a very nice event. It was a good sort of commemorative event for Theo, and at that time, I then started an operation with the help of one of my investigators. We started a surveillance operation on this male person, and within a very short period of time, we were able to speak to him and get him talking, and that led to us getting a lot of information from him. That then led us to knock on the doors of several people in Ballina. And as a result of those inquiries, we interviewed a female, and that female made admissions to me that she knew exactly what happened. She sort of made a full admission about what she knew, and she told me that if we go to an abandoned house in Nimbin, we will find property belonging to Theo. So that was quite an extraordinary piece of information. So we went to Nimbin, and we found there was only one abandoned house in Nimbin that was known to be occupied by homeless people, and it was a home just out of town that was owned by a local family. The parents had passed away, and the son had kept the home, kept the property. It was about 40 acres, I think. But he had never bothered to fix it up, or never been able to fix the house up and sell the property. I think it might be for sale now, but he assisted us, and we subsequently conducted a lawful search with the owner's permission. He actually attended the house with myself and one of my senior investigators, and we conducted a search only to find all of the belongings of another missing person, now deceased, by the name of Thea Little. She vanished from exactly the same spot that Theo left. Theo vanished from Tallow Beach in the bushes above the sand dunes. So we were quite shocked to find this evidence, all of her belongings there. Then we started to think, well, maybe the female that we interviewed in Ballina may have got the story wrong, but then there were other things that she had said that were attributable to Theo's case, not Thea. But clearly there's some sort of connection, and that these people have some sort of knowledge, and they were able to direct us to a house in Nembin, of which contained all of the belongings of a person who was found deceased in the sand dunes. It's extraordinary, really, when you think about it. So that's what happened, and we called police in. They were able to, sort of rope off the house and search it, and they removed most of the belongings. But the next day we went back and we found that they'd left still another bag full of property at the house, including a police fact sheet which indicated that this particular female, Thea, had problems with the police and had been charged with assault prior to her disappearance. So there was all this information that we took in. And then as a result of that, we conducted further interviews, including 2 prisoners that are currently serving inmates of the prison in Grafton, a female and a male, both the males in maximum security. And we got some very, very interesting information about the people that were named as being involved in Theo's disappearance. So those matters are still being investigated. Whenever you get these sort of leads, you always wonder whether you're on a wild goose chase. But there's quite some compelling information that's been given to us, and the type of people that were named, they're pretty horrible people. They've got extensive criminal records, and for drugs and violence and things like that. So they certainly fit the profile of people, the type of people that Theo may have ran into that night. And it's my belief that he certainly met with foul play. I don't believe that he had an accident. That's not my belief at all, based on the evidence that I'm seeing.
There was another case that really tugged at Ken's heartstrings. It became a case he simply could not let go.
That was Levana Oppa. Another one of my proudest cases in my whole career was rescuing her in Egypt. She was 5 years old when she was kidnapped by the father and taken into hiding. Australian mother, Egyptian father, and her mother was in Egypt. They were doing a parental visit to the father, and then he snatched her and disappeared, basically. Left her on the streets of Cairo crying. She didn't know what to do. She reached out to the Australian embassy. The embassy could do very little. And then they subsequently engaged me to help, because I had actually some jobs running in Egypt at the time. I was dealing with the police general. I had good contacts there. I had a local lawyer. I had all the connections in Cairo to be able to do this job. So I agreed to undertake some initial work on the case, and then it got to the point where there was no more budget. The budget had run out, and they had to terminate the investigation. But I felt really bad for the mother, and it's one of those jobs where I can't possibly turn my back on a mother whose daughter is missing. I decided to continue with the investigation, and I went back to Egypt on about 7 occasions following that initial investigation. 7 more trips to Egypt, and on the 7th trip, we were able to kick the father's door down with a police team and arrest him. And we actually captured the moment on film with our hidden camera when the little girl was now 7, was reunited with her mum. So extraordinary thing to witness, and that's probably the most exciting thing that ever happens in my job.
Did you have an Egyptian Agent X?
We did. We had a few of them, actually. But actually, it's funny you say that. We recruited some young lawyers who were trainee lawyers to be undercover agents, and we had a 3-month investigation that led to us infiltrating the family of the kidnapper, and that involved going to the same mosque, praying together, playing together. These guys mingled in the community where the kidnappers' parents lived. And it took 3 months for us to get the lead that we wanted, and that was a phone number from the phone of the kidnapper's younger brother. And we did that. It's an extraordinary story because it just took so much patience. And it was one lead. It was just a phone number that we got that led us, down this path to eventually locating the kidnapper with his new wife that he'd married again. And this little girl, they'd changed her name, and she wasn't speaking English. She was speaking Arabic by this time. And she was very distraught when all this went down, because suddenly the mother appears. It was very emotional time for the family and for everyone involved.
Ken was also responsible for busting open an Olympic ticketing scam.
Yeah, that was. I think that was in 2008. It was kind of one of my first experiences with a story that went viral around the world. It was the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. It was the first time I'd ever had my name on the front page of the paper. And it went viral all over the world. I had previously been involved in investigating ticket scams in the UK, so I'd done a lot of work overseas in Europe. Back in those days, I was spending half of my year in Europe, working in all over different countries, and also the UK, and travelling and working in Europe and the UK. So I had connections over there. So I was doing these ticketing scam investigations, and I identified a person who had a legitimate ticket shop in London as a cover for all these fraudulent sites. And I started monitoring this guy, and I started getting suspicious at some of the domains that he was registering, which was like Beijing Tickets 2008, Beijing Ticketing, Beijing Olympics.com, all these different websites that he was registering. And I thought, this guy's going to pull off a scam at the Olympic Games. This is in 2007. So I started monitoring and putting together a dossier on this guy and all these Beijing ticket sites. So what happened was, I reported it to the UK authorities, and nothing was done. Nothing was done about it. There was no investigation. There was no way of stopping, because there had been no crime committed. You see, it's very hard to stop things before it happens, because it's only allegations. So anyway, the authorities were powerless to do anything. But when the Olympics did start, it was a huge story around the world that this ticket scam had scammed lots of people, including one of our politicians. It had taken, I think one of the politicians lost about $30,000 that they'd paid for front row tickets.
But in the past few years, Ken has focused on the growth of cybercrime, particularly online fraud, which is one of the largest income earners for present-day criminals.
I started focusing my career on criminal cases, criminal fraud, because it's very black and white. You have a victim, normally a helpless person, quite vulnerable, that's lost their life savings. So you have a real victim and a real criminal, a real perpetrator who has committed a horrible crime against that victim, leaving them in financial ruin, destroying their life. So I stepped into this space of this was the perfect type of crime for me to investigate, because it was challenging. It involved international groups. It was very difficult. A lot of people would have said impossible to prosecute some of these gangs because they're so well protected. So I started working in this space of large-scale investment fraud. And as part of my work took me all over Southeast Asia. I spoke at a lot of law enforcement events, including Interpol, the Interpol event in Hong Kong. And I was approached by the head of the financial crimes police in Sri Lanka, who had asked me if I could attend a meeting in Singapore they were going to fly across and with their senior law enforcement officials and have a meeting with me, and they did. And by that stage, we were well and truly. We had mastered the art of tracking down assets overseas and how criminals launder money, and I was starting to learn a lot of tricks from criminals themselves, even some of the ones that we arrested, as to how they launder money. And I realised that the boiler room fraud industry is a multi-billion-dollar criminal industry that has been going under the radar for 2 or 3 decades. And it's still to this day, it's under the radar. They clean out hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars a year out of Australians. Our law enforcement agencies in Australia have never, ever gone into Southeast Asia and actively arrested any of these criminal gangs, and yet these gangs have taken billions of dollars from Australians. So I thought this might be a challenge for me. This might be something I might want to take on and prove that this can be done, that you can actually arrest these foreign gangs. You have to have established relationships in the Philippines. You have to have close relationships with the law enforcement agencies there. They have to trust you. It took me quite a while to build up those relationships over there, but luckily I did. I started working originally in the Philippines for the Motion Picture Association of America doing anti-piracy raids. So we did dozens of raids on pirates who were accused of selling pirated movies. I then did raids for Pfizer, the drug company, on counterfeit drugs. There was a fantastic cover story in the Wall Street Journal of one of my cases, which again was one of those moments where you smile and think, you really know you've made it as a private investigator. When if you're a muso, if you get on the cover of the Rolling Stones magazine, that's it. You've actually made it. But I was on the cover story in the Wall Street Journal, and that to me was pretty good. I was pretty happy about that. And that was a raid we did where we seized 150 computers in a raid that were selling counterfeit drugs, also to Australians and Americans and Canadians. So those operations led me to start then targeting boiler rooms, because I realised that this was a scourge on society. These operations, they still are to this day, roping in vulnerable investors to invest money into stocks and shares that don't actually exist. They were a criminal group doing what we call it's securities fraud. They were selling stocks and shares to Aussie investors, mums and dads, elderly people, just pretending to be a hotshot brokerage firm in the US or UK, and they would sell stocks and shares that don't exist. So they would purchase, the victim would purchase the shares, but the shares don't really actually exist. So they were buying shares that were non-existent, and their money wasn't really going to the shares, it was going into the pockets of criminals. So yeah, it's a very lucrative enterprise. So I took a very active interest in this type of fraud, and also cryptocurrency, which was emerging. About 5 years ago, cryptocurrency started to emerge heavily in the criminal circles. Now it's almost exclusively what criminals are using to launder money. So I realise that we are facing a new challenge. And when I say we, I mean our government, our law enforcement agencies, our police all over the world are facing new challenges that are going to be they have to be approached in a very different way to what law enforcement are currently doing to approach these problems. So I decided that my career would start focusing on this particular type of investment fraud, because it's such a big problem. There's a huge amount of work. It's very profitable for the criminals, and it's also good commercially for us, because we take a percentage, a commission of whatever we recover. So if we get a big success, then we get a reward, and I think that's fair, because we put our lives at risk going into these countries. I've had multiple death threats from these groups saying that if I come back to the Philippines, I'm going to have a bullet in my head within 24 hours. This sort of thing. So that happened quite quite a number of times. In fact, I did a documentary called Swindle Kings of Manila with Al Jazeera back in 2018, and they interviewed one of the guys that was hired to kill me on that story.
During his years as a private eye, Ken has realised that criminal enterprises like these are growing, and probably even more so because of COVID-19.
This is a huge criminal industry around the world. The counterfeit medications still out there. It's a huge criminal industry, so it will always be there. And I have no doubt that they're counterfeiting vaccines, and there's certainly been a lot of scams since COVID came out. There has been an enormous amount of scams and frauds, online scams relating to vaccines and so forth. But because I'm no longer working with Pfizer or any of the major drug companies, I no longer have much of a insight into the problem. But I know that when we were looking into the syndicates in the Philippines, the particular operations that we looked at were the masterminds were from Israel, and they were very well controlled. There was a lot of money involved in this industry, and they were selling these what they call online pharmacies. They were selling the product to people online, and they were shipping the product out. So I wouldn't be surprised if Australians and other nationalities are probably still buying product from these online pharmacies. And those online pharmacies look very professional, but they're unregulated and they're actually run by criminals.
In the next episode, we hear about the undercover work of Australia's longest licensed private eye, Keith Shafirius. Keith reveals how he had to shoot out the tyres of a semi-trailer that was headed straight for him, shared breakfast with Imelda Marcos while on a stakeout in the Philippines, and met a young Donald Trump who even back then talked about himself and his money and his girls.